Welcome everybody. This is part 2 of the anti-bullying Minnesota legislation. And again, I have Barb Anderson with me from the Minnesota Child Protection League, and Walter Hudson, who is a PJ Media consultant and contributor, as well as a parent. And we're going to go into depth now. Now that we've given you the base the first time through on this legislation, we're going to go into more depth on the bill, some examples, and then what can be done by your viewers, either as a citizen or as a parent or whatever. So why don't we start with who were the members and people that were part of Dayton's bully task force? Does somebody have that information as to generally who was there? I looked at a few of them, and it looked like there was maybe one educator on it, which doesn't surprise me. If we're talking about education here and bullying, that we would exclude some of those. It appeared to be more in the lines of a specialty group in the homosexual area that had a couple of members on it. Some legislators, I think, were on it, and that was all I could look at quickly. But were there more people that were involved, or were there more parents even involved, or educators than I'm aware of?
Well, my concern was that there really was a disproportionate number of, how would you put it, sexual diversity advocates on that panel. And I do not feel that task force really represented the cross-section of Minnesotans and what they're concerned about with what goes on in the schools.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the specific breakdown of how many and who and what their names are and whatnot. But what I'll tell you generally is that what we need to understand is kind of the process of how these things come together. First of all, whenever you have a task force that is put together by executive order, it's inherently going to be a political endeavor, right? Now, they're going to sell this thing, and they have sold this thing, as being something that is from the community, it's of the grassroots, it's coming from the bottom up, and parents and administrators and children and students are crying for it, and everybody's excited about it. Nothing could be further from the truth. This thing is top down all the way. As we mentioned in part 1, it's something that's been formulated by a national coalition of activists who have a very particular agenda, and it is the sexual diversity agenda.
Right.
The normalization of homosexuality and a number of other lifestyles. That is the agenda. And the folks who are prominent in that movement here in Minnesota, a disproportionate number of them, to be sure, were on the task force.
Okay.
And so what they did in order to give it this kind of air of being locally developed is they shopped it around at a number of forums or focus groups or whatever you want to call them to get feedback and input, which of course they then cherry pick and give you these nice little excerpts that make it sound like this is the best thing since sliced bread.
Right.
And, there's a consensus and everybody should get on board.
Okay. Now let's get to, I guess, the bill maybe in more depth as to how it functionally will work from both the institution, as we talked about before, about the new bureaucrats who will be overseeing this, then the piece that relates to the investigation, I'm assuming enforcement, data collection that is going to be connected with the Minnesota Department of Education. And then how maybe an example of a school district and a classroom teacher or person would actually work. And I'm not sure which of you would be best to try to talk about that. I know that's a kind of a big piece, but I think it's important to understand logistically as an example of how this actually in practice is going to work.
Well, we probably both have examples that we could share in this area, and one that comes to mind for me is a story that happened recently, a true story about a young girl who was called in and she had a report against her that she was bullying. So the principal called her into the office and asked if she had called this young man to his face a creepy stalker. Well, she said no, she had not, and she was very frightened. It's frightening to be called into a principal's office and be charged with bullying. So then she decided, the principal believed the girl and dropped the matter, and it was the end of that. But now let's fast forward to a time where this, heaven forbid, is law, this bill, and this young girl, then the teacher would have to fill out the form, the principal would have to fill out the form, it would then go to the person in charge of the investigation in the specific office. That would then be referred to the school climate center. This would go into their database, and this would follow this student on her record, and she may have to go through re-education, remediation, counseling, mental health counseling for, calling somebody like this. And really what had happened in this situation was, when they found out how this claim came about, is that this young boy had been stalking this girl, had been following her, was in her face when he would see her, wait for her after class. So she went home and she told her father, "He's a creepy stalker and I don't want him around me." This conversation was overheard, and it was passed on to someone who passed it on to the young boy. This young boy perceived that he had been defamed in some way, that he had been bullying. So he filed this bullying charge. And this is how this will happen many times over. And you probably have other examples of what could happen to children.
Okay, so here's what's happening now, today. There is a student in Shakopee High School, and I'm not familiar with all the details of the case, but this kid, he was a football player. He's involved in a number of sports. He, the last I heard, was out of school as a consequence of allegations that were brought against him related to a tweet that he put out.
Okay.
And the content of the tweet, paraphrase, was something along the lines of, "I'm going to drill my teammates at practice today," or something along those lines.
I think I've heard of that on the news already, yes?
A very clear colloquial reference to tackling, going out there, and I'm going to be a good player today and tackle my teammates in practice. Because we have removed already, before this legislation, before this new bureaucracy has been imposed from the top down, we have already removed the individual judgment. When we talk about Barb's story of the principal who hears the girl say, "I didn't do that," and then the principal makes a value judgment of, okay, based on what I know of this girl and the accuser and the situation, I am judging as an individual who's in charge of this school that this is a matter we can drop.
Which is in their job description to do that, and it has been for how many years?
Yes.
Trained in that area, yes.
The ability of individuals in positions like a principal or a teacher to make their own individual value judgments has already been deterred by the amount of state-down or top-down state control of the processes. And so you get a situation where, even though I guarantee you, whoever's looking at that tweet, the first person who looked at that tweet after it was reported, is probably thinking, "Oh, this is nothing."
Right.
And then their second thought is, "But," you know what I'm saying? What happens to me if it is something?
Well, what's
like
the liability?
Right.
What's
What's the liability?
Right.
And like the 3% chance that it is something, and I don't do something about it. And that's, again, before we've implemented this bill. We put this on top of that. You're talking about creating, this is, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but you're creating an environment of terror for students, for teachers, for administrators, for anybody who's involved. You talked about volunteers. How are you going to get somebody to volunteer to come help out at the school when they're taking on this kind of liability?
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And again, I think that, and that's why I think, hopefully this is going to be helpful for people out there, because I think it's something that is not well known. So hopefully you can spread this around to your influence of people, because I think in most people, would consider this to be overkill. You know, even what you're talking about, Walter, with that case is, in my mind, overkill. I was, a student manager a number of years ago, graduated, a long time ago, but on the football team, that was a common, and it still is, a common term. So if you don't, and again, yes, it can have multiple meanings, but if you look at it and common sense, and I know that is something that we're not necessarily using all that often, to understand the context of it. And again, yes, somebody should take that step, but they shouldn't be forced then to assume that the person had ulterior motives, or somebody to come and say, well, I'm offended by that, even if it wasn't directed directly toward them. And that's why I can see this going, is that there's so many hearsay. If we want to look at evidence standpoint, look at it from a legal standpoint, where this hearsay stuff is going to go all over the place.
So in the bill, and also in the task force report, which informed the bill, you have bullying is defined in part as behavior which is objectively offensive. Now, this is an oxymoron.
Correct.
This is absolutely ridiculous. Being offended is always a subjective experience.
Right.
So, too, is making disciplinary judgments in these types of situations.
Yep.
No matter who's making the decision as to what should be done and whether something's appropriate or inappropriate, it is always going to be a subjective judgment. And so the question becomes, who gets to make it? The person closest to the situation, most familiar with the people and the culture, who can interpret, who can know, oh yeah, of course, I worked with kids. I was on the football team as coaching staff. I know what drilling teammates means.
Right.
It doesn't mean that I'm going to kill them
Right.
or assault them.
Right.
Or are we going to have some committee, some far-off council
Right.
in St. Paul make that subjective judgment with no knowledge whatsoever of who the people are or what's going on?
And the other thing, and I think both of you have alluded to it, is that this is a permanent record type issue. And my understanding, and maybe you guys can correct it, it doesn't appear that there is an appeal process to get it removed once it's on there. Even, like in your case, Barb, that you brought up, where, again, the principal in the current case said there was nothing. Even if it went and was determined that same thing was determined, the child may have had to go through immense pain and agony and mental anguish before they even got to the determination that it was all false.
Oh, that's right. And that child may never get to face an accuser if it's an
Right.
anonymous type of report, and the parents are not brought into the situation. So parents, this is something that should really concern you, that your child could go through mental health counseling without you knowing about it and without knowing what kind of effect this is going to have on your child in the long term. So this is a very dangerous bill because of the very subjective, vague language that is a part of it, which includes if a student feels he's defamed or if it causes emotional distress. Just like Walter said, these are very subjective terms, and who's going to make those decisions?
Yeah.